I will focus actually on the Eurozone and crisis situations in the Eurozone. And my colleagues, I'm sure, will focus more on the more global situation. So let me share my screen here. So the question I'm asking is whether the crisis that we have seen in the Eurozone in the period 2010-2012, whether that is over, right? And let me start out with a picture. Sometimes a picture is worth 1,000 words, and here is such a picture that tells a story about stability and instability. And what I show you here is the spreads in 10-year government bonds in the Eurozone from the early 1990s until 2022. And the spreads here are defined as the differences in the yields of 10-year government bonds of each of these countries with the German 10-year government bond. And you can see here a number of interesting things. First, in the period before the Eurozone started, and that is shown with the vertical line there, we saw quite significant spreads, right? These were the days where these countries had their own currencies, and as a result, these spreads basically reflected devaluation risks. Take, for example, Greece, there the Greek spreads, they were quite high, exceeding 10% quite often, indicating that investors expected the Greek drachma to depreciate on average by more than 10% a year, right, over the lifespan of the bond. And you can see other spreads there that all reflected these devaluation risks. Then the Eurozone started, and this devaluation risk essentially disappeared. And there was a whole period, almost 10 years, where these spreads actually were zero. But then suddenly with the financial crisis, again, spreads increased, of course, this time not reflecting devaluation risk, but reflecting something else, namely perceptions of default risk. And these were actually quite high, as you can see, that typically exceeded the spreads that we saw in the 1990s. And then at a certain moment, spreads converged again, but I will come back to that. So what you also see from this graph here is that the countries that in the 1990s faced devaluation risks turned out to be also the countries later on that experienced default risks. And in order to show that in a different way, I did the following. I computed the average yields, spreads during the 1990s on the horizontal axis of each of these countries. And on the vertical axis, I show the spreads during the period 2010-2012 of these same countries. And you can see that actually the spreads of the 1990s, right, are relatively good predictors of the spreads that occurred later on during the sovereign debt crisis. So there was some variation, of course, it's not perfect, but surely it's a relatively good predictor. Countries that in the 1990s were in trouble in the foreign exchange market turned out to be countries that in the government bond markets would be in trouble during the sovereign debt crisis. So what do we learn from these graphs? Well, first of all, that both fixed exchange rates and monetary union are fragile. And we thought that when we abolished the foreign exchange markets in Europe by joining a monetary union, speculative crisis would disappear. They did in the foreign exchange market because these foreign exchange markets ceased to exist, but they returned in the government bond markets. In other words, we shifted this risk away from the foreign exchange markets to the government bond markets. Why? Because essentially the nature of the fragility is the same in the foreign exchange markets in the 1990s and later on in the government bond markets in a monetary union. And this is well known for fixed exchange rate systems. It's based on this analysis of self-fulfilling crisis. Countries announce a fixed exchange rate and promise to convert domestic currency into foreign exchange at a fixed rate today and in the future. But at some point, credibility problems arise. The central banks may not have the means to defend the fixed rate, and then a self-fulfilling crisis can be set in motion. That's the story for foreign exchange market, and essentially for the government bond markets in a monetary union, we have a similar story, same structure. So let me go into this in just a little more in detail. Governments of the member countries of a monetary union issue bonds which they promise to convert at maturity in a currency over which they have no control, right? It is as if each of these governments issued debt in a foreign currency, like Argentina does it when it issued debt in dollars, right? And as a result, these governments cannot give 100% guarantee to the bondholders that they will have the necessary liquidity to pay them out at maturity. And that creates the risk of self-fulfilling liquidity crisis. When confidence disappears, then investors will massively sell, raising the yields and imposing great stress on these governments. That's the nature of the fragility in the monetary union, which does not exist in standalone countries that are backed by a central bank, right? Because the investors know that these governments will never run out of cash because they have a central bank that is ready to provide cash to the government in times of crisis. And therefore, investors cannot force a default on standalone countries' governments, which is a contrast with governments in a monetary union. And this has quite an implication, that is, when we switched in Europe from standalone countries to a monetary union, actually, there was also a shift of the balance of power in favor of financial markets against the sovereigns, right? And the question I now want to analyze is, how has this fundamental problem evolved in the Eurozone? And here I have the same picture that I showed you earlier, but I restricted in a time, only during the history of the Eurozone. I show the same government bond spreads. And I distinguished three periods here: the pre-crisis, the crisis, and the post-crisis period. In the pre-crisis period, we see the following. This was a period where the government bonds were actually considered to be perfect substitutes. Investors considered a Greek bond to have the same risk as a German bond, right? And as a result, the yields were practically the same. An extraordinary situation when you look at it now, right, with the benefit of hindsight. But it is quite extraordinary that during such a long period, that's what was the perception and the beliefs in markets. Then came the crisis. It was triggered by the financial crisis, and suddenly it was like a wake-up call. The risk perceptions changed completely, right? Some countries were hit much more by the crisis, had great difficulties in controlling the government deficits and debt situations, and a self-fulfilling crisis erupted that had the nature that I described earlier, where investors massively sold Greek bonds, and then later on also Spanish and Irish and Portuguese bonds and all that, right? Pushing countries actually in a bad equilibrium because they were forced to impose austerity to find the liquidity to satisfy the bondholders. And then it took the ECB some time to realize that it has a responsibility to provide liquidity in government bond markets. And this is what it did in 2012. And then you can see that these spreads collapsed, right? And we tended to converge again. There were some difficulties, especially with Greece on the road. But on the whole, one can say that ultimately there was, again, a convergence of the spreads, although we never reached the situation of the pre-crisis periods when spreads were essentially zero. We maintained spreads, now much less important than during the crisis, but still there, and I will come back to that in a minute. Then came the pandemic, right? And at that, this was a huge shock. It was a symmetric shock, but it had very asymmetric effects. I show you this here, the GDP growth during 2020. This was highly negative, but with a high spread here, right? So the shock was the same, but the implications were much different. And you can see that especially southern countries experienced much bigger drops in GDP than other countries. So that we can really say this was a symmetric shock with very asymmetric implications. And this, of course, led to the fear that a new sovereign debt crisis could occur. But in fact, it didn't. And here I'm showing you again these 10-year government bonds, but the same figure that I showed you earlier, but now a blow up, right? I concentrate on the period from 2019 to 2022, and also the scale of the vertical axis is different, right, than in the previous figure that I showed, but essentially the same information. So what you can see here that there was a hiccup when the pandemic started, the spreads increased again, but then it went down again, and the convergence continued as it had been doing before until 2021. I'll come back to that because that's a surge of inflation. But let's concentrate on this period immediately after the pandemic. And there we see no crisis erupted. And why is that? Well, here my interpretation is that essentially it has to do with the new governance of the Eurozone that emerged after the sovereign debt crisis, and that allowed European policymakers to use new instruments of stabilization that allowed us also to avoid self-fulfilling crises in the government bond markets. What were these instruments? They were both monetary and fiscal. The monetary instrument was, of course, the OMT program that the ECB had in fact launched in 2012 when it turned around the market, and the expectation was during the pandemic that the ECB would be willing to do so. And in fact, this was reinforced by the announcement by the ECB of its Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, the PEPP, which was an additional program that the ECB announced to provide liquidity in the sovereign bond markets. And as a result, these spreads quickly declined, right? So basically the ECB had learned the lesson in order to avoid potential crisis in government bond markets. It has to stand ready to provide liquidity and make it very clear it will do so. And that's exactly what happened. There was also a fiscal instrument, a major new fiscal instrument, the Next Generation EU, which was funded by the issue of common bonds. And half of that was actually used as pure transfers to governments that were hit mostly by the pandemic. And this added also to the sense of confidence that the system is there, will be solid, right? And as a result, no such crisis erupted. Now, finally, let me focus a little bit on inflation. If the surge of inflation, can that not lead to a new sovereign debt crisis in the Eurozone? And as you can see here, from 2021, the spreads increased again, right? Which coincided with the fact that the ECB raised the interest rate, and apparently this led to a more than proportional increase of the interest rates of the weaker countries in the system. But note that this surge has been relatively mild, right? When you compare to what has happened in the past, it's certainly much milder than we have seen before. But surely there's a potential risk here. And so let me go into that in the following way. The surge in inflation creates two dilemmas for the ECB. The first dilemma is the one that all central banks face.
Paul, I have a request. If you can finish in 3 minutes, simply because of the time constraint.
Yeah. So the first dilemma is well known. A central bank, after a supply shock, negative supply shock, raises the interest rate to fight inflation, but in doing so, it risks recession. If it wants to fight a recession, this will lead to a problem with inflation. Therefore, it's a dilemma situation that all central banks face. In addition, the ECB faces another dilemma, which has to do with stability in the sovereign bond markets. As I've told you, when the interest rates increase, this has differential effect on the long-term bond rates in all these different countries, and it could lead to a situation where the high-risk countries face more than proportional increases in their yields, and that could trigger a crisis. Up to now, this has not really been a serious problem, but this is something that could occur when the ECB is forced to go much further into its inflation-fighting policy. This also explains why the ECB has been more cautious in hiking interest rates than the US Fed and the Bank of England. Let me conclude. To maintain stability in the monetary union, there must be a commitment from the common central bank to support national governments in times of crisis. That's what we have learned. The question is, will the ECB always be ready to support national governments in the future? And one can have reasonable doubts about this. Future governing council that consists of different central bankers and different moods and perceptions may not always be ready to do so, right? But one cannot really be sure about this. It's not a firm, it's not something that would be there that we can be 100% sure of. And as a result, there is still a fundamental credibility issue about the willingness of the ECB to be a lender of last resort in government bond markets under all future circumstances. And this will continue to make the Eurozone a fragile construction. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Paul, and hopefully you will stick with us. If time will allow, there will be a short Q&A. So thank you very much for the clarity of your presentation. So let me turn maybe to the next presentation, and I'll do my best to stick to 15 minutes dealing with the relevant of the trilemma, the open economy trilemma for the 21st century. Hopefully, the control will allow my PowerPoints to appear. Otherwise, I'll be forced to improvise in real time. So until I see the PowerPoints, let me point out that the original trilemma, open economy trilemma, was framed by Mondale in the context of the events propagated by the Bretton Woods agreements. And his seminal contribution going back to the 1960s pointed out that due to arbitrage forces operating through the capital market, countries at best have the ability to choose only two out of three possible policy goals. And the original trilemma stated in the context of the textbook triangle that a country at best can choose only two out of three possible goals: exchange rate stability, macro monetary control, and financial integration. And this, I'm sorry that the control above cannot put the PowerPoints, so let me keep the presentation without the PowerPoint. The trilemma originally was framed as a stark binary choice between three options. And this fitted very well the era of the Bretton Woods Agreement, because de facto, this agreement was anchored by the US dollar, and most of the relevant countries that were part of the agreement pegged their currency to the US dollar. In addition, if you recall, private capital flows are practically nil. They were highly regulated. And this system seemed to operate well in the first phase of the recovery of Europe and Western Europe and Japan. But we know that down the road, it collapsed after 30, 35 years. And this generated a new global transition into a new version of the trilemma. And the sequence that followed was that the US de facto moved towards a flexible exchange rate. And down the road, we observed the emergence of new important global operators. And if you are looking at the sequence of events, in the 90s, a lot of the emerging markets, including Poland in Europe, including Mexico, and most Latin American countries, experimented with greater exposure to financial flows while they attempted to keep a fixed exchange rate, something that by definition was against the logic of the trilemma. And the outcome has been that in the 90s, most of the emerging markets went through sequence of events that were characterized by Guillermo Calvo as sudden stop crises that were propagated by the reversal of financial inflows. And the outcome was that they were forced frequently to give up the elusive agenda of taking the exchange rate while opening themselves to financial flows. And most of them chose to move into the center, if you wish, of the trilemma triangle. This implies that they opted to operate under a managed flexibility of the exchange rate, buffered by growing accumulation and management of international reserves. And this evolution implied that down the road, within practically 10, 15 years, a fair share of emerging markets ended up moving into the middle of the trilemma triangle in the sense that they opted to manage their system in a way that will minimize the exposure to financial instability. Now, this suggests to us, and as I'm referring to my co-authors, Mezichin and Hirohito and myself, that the events generated by the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, with a lag, generated a lot of underregulated financial flows, implying that to the original three goals of the trilemma, financial stability was added as a major policy challenge facing most central banks and indirectly also a fair share of the treasuries. Thus, the trilemma morphed, if you wish, into a quadrilemma, in the sense that a fourth dimension of financial stability was added. We know that this implies that countries should add new instruments in order to be able to grapple with this new important policy goal. And down the road, these new instruments included a growing vector of policies. They included active management of exchange rate. Some countries opened up sovereign wealth funds and actively managing them as another buffer. It included also macroprudential regulations that some are referring as proactive policies. And the big picture is that countries also recognize that there is a certain logic if the major powers, emerging powers, will use a new instrument or a new incarnation of the instrument of swap lines. And the point that I would like to make is that the main change over time is that by now we are converging to three blocks that are controlling more than half of the GDP. And by now they have almost a symmetric size adjusted for a purchasing power parity. the US, the EU, which is the majority of the countries of the EU are relying on the on the euro, and China. And in my recent research, I focused on the growing use of swap lines as a new instrument that is used in the context of the sequence of recent events. And I would like to mention that the good example of the latest use has been the activation of the swap lines by the Fed in a new incarnation during the COVID crisis. Now, if you are, I cannot show you the PowerPoints, but if you are looking at the activation of swap lines during the, yeah, no, I'm almost done. So the, maybe the best will be if you will post down the road all the PowerPoints that were submitted. But the point of the new activation of swap lines by the Fed around the COVID crisis is that this is potentially part of the global competition, emerging global competition between the US and China in terms of trying to control the new incarnation of the trilemma for the 21st century, where financial stability is playing a key role. And if you recall, the new activation of swap lines around the COVID crisis included FEMA arrangements that de facto allow countries that are sitting on a pile of international reserves in the form of US government bonds to get preferred access to credit lines de facto using the US government bonds as a collateral. Now, China started playing its own role of activating swap lines, and the latest incarnation is that China by now is has emerged as a major supplier of credit to mostly the countries in its sphere of influence as part of the Belt agenda, which is generally covering first its immediate periphery of in Asia, but the global reach includes, of course, a fair share of Latin American countries, of African countries and the like. And China by now is a huge lender that is confronting with the fact that some of the financing of the Belt project is facing sovereign defaults, and China now is assertively using its swap lines as a way of managing its own challenges in the context of the sovereign lending of China, which is facing now growing sovereign risk and de facto default. So my conclusion of this quick overview is that the Bretton Woods Agreement fitted the original framing of the trilemma. Not anymore. In the 21st century, we are added financial stability as a key dimension of the potential goals of central banks and indirectly treasuries. And chances are that we are converging slowly but surely into a polarized configuration where only time will tell what will be the degree of cooperation or competition between the three emerging economic powers. So far, the US dollar retained its dominance, but down the road, it's fair to predict that future geopolitical events and the degree to which countries will cooperate or will compete will dictate the degree to which we are moving towards a new configuration where there will be robust competition of the type that we have seen emerging between China and the US. And it will be up to the EU to decide how to place itself in this configuration. Let me stop here, and I'm sorry that you cannot, we cannot share the transparencies, but hopefully there'll be a way to post them. Let me ask Sebastian maybe to continue.
Thank you very much, Joshua. I'm sorry you didn't get the PowerPoint. So my name is Sebastian Edwards, and I'm a professor at UCLA, and I'm deeply honored to be invited here. Joshua, you're going to keep my time, and you're going to let me know when I'm almost done. So I don't have my slides either, but any of you who wants my slides, you can ask me, and I will be very happy to email them back to you. So the title of my talk is a question, and the question is, will the US dollar continue to be at the center of the international financial system? So in that sense, it's a Copernicus type of question. The main difference, of course, is that we believe firmly that Copernicus' discovery that the sun was at the center of our system, that discovery is immutable. It will stay at the center. But of course, the US dollar doesn't need to stay at the center of the financial system. And it was not always at the center. It replaced sterling and so on. So the first slide that I had was a slide which had a column by Martin Wolf in the Financial Times, and asking or saying, he was stating that the debt ceiling and the debt crisis that the United States is facing today, and we don't know if there will be an agreement in Congress to raise the ceiling of the debt in the United States. And so Martin Wolf was saying, well, this may contribute to the demise of the dollar as the main currency in the international financial system. I'm going to argue, and let me just give you the bottom line of my talk, that we will solve the debt ceiling problem one way or another. It may be delayed. There may be a downgrade. As you remember last time that this happened, the United States was downgraded from AAA to AA. We may be downgraded to single A. But I don't think that the dollar will anytime soon be replaced in the international financial markets. We may have arrangements similar to what Joshua was talking about, where there will be greater cooperation and greater swap lines and the like. But I think that in spite of whatever happened with the debt crisis, the dollar will continue to be at the center of the international financial system, among other things, because we have to answer the question, which currency will replace the dollar? And if you go through the list, there aren't too many candidates. The only candidate that I think is a serious candidate to replace the dollar is the euro. I don't think that the yuan is even closer. First of all, it would have to become a fully convertible currency in order to be at the center, and that I don't see it happening anytime soon. So what I did in my paper, and still don't have the PowerPoint, so I'm going to proceed as if we will never get the PowerPoint, is I go back in history and I explore one particular episode where the United States did default on its debt. And at the end, the dollar not only continued at the center of the international financial system, but its role as the main currency was actually strengthened. And the episode that I have in mind, it's also related to what Paul de Grauwe was saying. It is the 1933 episode where the United States got off the gold standard. Okay? So at the time, Paul was saying that one of the issues that was very interesting with the adoption of the euro was that governments were issuing bonds in a currency that they did not control. In the 19th century and the first 30 years of the 20th century, the US government and most US corporations issued bonds in a currency they did not control, and that was gold. All the debt of the United States, the government debt, by law, and most of the corporate debt was denominated in gold. But of course, the price of gold had been fixed since 1834 at $20.67 per ounce, and it was as if it was the same thing. except that on April 5, or April 19, 1933, the United States got off the gold standard. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt was of the idea that we should devalue the dollar with respect to gold, and the devaluation is going to increase the degree of competitiveness of the United States, and we are going to export ourselves out of the Great Depression. Now, I know that there are lots of people here that are experts in the history of economic thought. Very interesting, at that time, the history, the thinking about exchange rate arrangements was mostly non-existent. If you think of what we teach our students about the effectiveness of devaluations or exchange rate depreciations, they are based on the Marshall-Lerner condition that states that the sum of the elasticities of demand and supply for export and imports should exceed 1. The Marshall-Lerner condition had not been developed in 1933. Marshall had written his treatise on commerce, and in the appendix, there is a sort of a draft of that proof, but Abba Lerner's paper is from 1939. There had been no devaluation in the history of the United States, so they were sailing and flying completely in the dark without knowing what was going to happen. So what was the problem? The problem was that the dollar had to be devalued according to FDR, but all the debt was in gold terms. So if the price of gold went up, the United States debt, which at the time was about 1/2 of what it is today in terms of GDP, would increase equiproportionally in dollar terms relative to the devaluation. And every public utility, every railway, most mortgage corporations would go bankrupt. So what did they decide? They decided, well, we're going to change the law. Because, of course, after 1932, after the election of 1932, when Roosevelt was elected, the Democratic Party controlled, with a vast majority, both houses of Congress. And on June 5th of 1933, in a joint session, Congress decided to change retroactively all the laws, and the gold clause in all bonds was eliminated, and now you could pay your bonds. If you were an issuer, you were a debtor, you could pay them in paper dollars. A few months later, there's something that happens in between. I don't have the time to get into it. A few months later, in January of 1934, the dollar is officially devalued. In between, the United States behaves like Argentina. In between, where the dollar is devalued in January of 1934, and the new price is $35 to an ounce, which lasted until 1971. Immediately, lawsuits were presented to the different courts, and creditors asked to be paid using the new price of gold. I bought a bond that had a certain value in gold terms. I want to get the equivalent in gold terms under the new exchange rate, which would be 41% higher. And those lawsuits went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in February of 1935 that it was okay to retroactively get rid of the most important clause in these debt contracts, and that it was fine to pay those debts in paper dollars and not in gold. That means that the United States behaved identically to the way Argentina tried to behave in 2001. Between 1991 and 2001, Argentina issued debt in dollar terms, and in 2001, the 1 peso, $1 link was eliminated, and retroactively, Argentina said, now we will pay all the debt in paper pesos and not in dollars. So the question is, there are two questions here. One is, what were the arguments that the Supreme Court used to abrogate the gold clause, and what were the consequences? And they wiped out 40% of the assets of the bondholders, right? So there were 3 cases that went to the Supreme Court. There are 2 that are the most important. One had to do with government debt, Liberty bonds that had been issued during World War I in order to finance the war. And by the way, it's that act, the Liberty Bonds Act of 1917, the one that determines the debt ceiling that we are dealing with today, $30 trillion. And we reached that debt ceiling, and we are about to default if that is not changed. So the Supreme Court, as I said, faced two different cases. The first one, sorry, but jet lag, as you know, dehydrates you. The first one had to do with government bonds, and the second one had to do with a railway bond. So one case was public debt, the other case was private debt. So the Supreme Court, which at the time was conformed very similarly to what it is today. There were 5 Republicans and 4 Democrats. The Chief Justice was Charles Evans Hughes, who was very much like the current Chief Justice, John Roberts, in the sense that he was a Republican, but he was a centrist and tried to keep the court within a certain range in the center. And the argument was that the Constitution gives the Congress the right to mint currency. Remember, Copernicus was very fundamental in minting. So the Constitution in the United States gives Congress the right to mint currency and determine the value thereof. That's what Article 1, Section 8 says. And the Supreme Court concluded that that meant that if in order to run monetary policy, the government or Congress decided to devalue and retroactively change contracts, that was constitutionally excuse me, I got it wrong. Let me constitutional, okay, let me get it, I got it wrong.
Sebastian,
yes.
Please finish in 5 minutes.
5 minutes, okay, in 5 minutes I'll fix everything here. That was the argument for the private debt. So since the Constitution gave the Congress the right to mint currency and determine the value thereof, Congress could change the value of private contracts at will. And that's Mike's presentation. So it was okay to change the value of these private contracts. Now, the most difficult part was what to do with the public debt. Did that article of the Constitution also give the freedom to Congress to default on the public debt? So the private was okay. Public debt, the Supreme Court said no. The Constitution does not allow the Congress to change the value of government debt. Why? Because there's another part of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, that says that the government has to pay its own debts. So you cannot put one article against another, and you cannot default on government debt. So it was okay to default on the private, to change the contracts for private debt. Public debts, no. So what did they do? They said, well, let's now calculate what are the damages that the devaluation of or the default on the debt, the devaluation of the dollar with respect to gold, what are the damages that it has produced? And they concluded that because there had been a deflation, there were no damages. The amount of paper dollars that you were receiving in payment in 1935, because of the deflation, allowed you to buy more goods than when it was issued. So it was unconstitutional, defaulting, but there were no damages. What happened immediately afterwards, and this is very important, and I will finish with this. What happened is that in the next few years, the US received massive amounts of gold from the rest of the world. That resulted in an increase in the supply of base money and through the multiplier in M1. And the US started to recover until 1937 when monetary fiscal policy turned around. So the point that I'm making is that yes, we have defaulted in the past. And no, that did not put an end to the centrality of the US dollar in the world international system. On the contrary, the dollar got strengthened in that situation, which is not what it's going to happen now, but there are separate avenues between the two events. So I recommend of those of you that are concerned and worried about what will happen with if we now default on the debt with the dollar, go back in history, look at 1933, analyze the 1935 decision by the Supreme Court, and you will see that if you have the exorbitant privilege that the US has, you may default a little bit on your debt or for a little time, and you can still run the system by issuing more and more dollars. Thank you so much. And if you need my presentation, I'll be very happy to give it to you. Thank you.
Sebastian, thank you very much. My suggestion is that we will post the PowerPoints on our webpage, and the interested parties will have access. Luckily, we have hopefully access to the PowerPoints for the last presentation by Professor Bordo.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm very glad that the slides work, because without them, this talk would be difficult. This is a paper I'm doing with Cécile Bastidon. She's an economist in France, University of Toulon, and she's also a physicist. Okay, so we collaborated on this, and I was thinking about the conference, and really there's a connection between the Copernican heliocentric system and the international monetary system. And so that's how I'm going to talk about the history of the international monetary and financial system in terms of this analogy. Okay, so let's, okay, now what? What's happening now? Okay, now you will get my slide. Okay, okay, so this is the, okay. Okay, so we can think of the evolution of the international monetary and financial regimes in terms of, yeah, this is going faster than I want. Okay, in terms of the network representations that are developed in economics, and we can think of an analogy to Copernicus. And basically, you know, his system was a model that preceded observation. It was innovative. It paved the way for future developments. Okay, and also it led to modern astrophysics. It talks about the life cycles of stars, and network analysis can be used to both think of the international monetary and financial system and the Copernican system. So the first thing is, it was invented, his theories came before observation. Okay, and this is a simple model. It was discussed yesterday. The world used to believe in the polemic, yes, in the Ptolemaic version that the universe, all the planets revolved around the Earth. Okay, and what Copernicus did was put the sun in the middle. And so this is the figure, that's famous figure right here. Okay, and also there were some issues with the system, and others later developed it, Kepler, okay, and then the astrophysicists pushed this and talked about the life cycles of stars. Okay, so what we do is we look at a network representation. So this slide shows you networks, okay, from economic history of currencies. So the upper panel comes from work by Flandreau, which shows the network of quotes of bills of exchange across the world in 1900. And the lower panel shows this work I've done with Cécile and others, which looks at stock markets and the connections between them. Okay, so, yeah. And so what we do is basically we identify a series of regimes which switch over time. Okay, and we can think of these international monetary and financial regimes kind of like the solar system. So on the left, you've got a tree network that shows like the sun in the middle and all the planets, and you can see how that is equivalent to the middle diagram, which is in terms of the heliocentric system in circles. And so what we do is this thing seems to go by itself. I don't know why. And so what we do is we apply this to the international monetary system. Okay, so here's the hub is the center. That's where, say, the sun. And then there's the core, which are in the upper panel, the yellow dot. Okay, that's the dominant currency. So the international monetary system, that's the dollar today. Okay, we go back. Okay, pound back under the gold standard. The lower panel shows the international financial system, and the hub was London, and then there were other centers like Paris and Berlin, and then other centers. So it's these concentric.
You have to hold your microphone close to your mouth.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so what we do is we model it as a regime-changing network. Okay, this diagram shows you all of the regimes. Okay, on the left-hand side, it keeps switching too fast. Okay, on the left-hand side, we have these circles that show you the top one is the gold standard in the middle. The second is the gold exchange standard with gold and the dollar. Third is Bretton Woods based on the dollar, but also based on gold. And the last is the current regime of floating based on credibility for monetary policy. And the right side, okay, shows you the international financial system, which shows you the center is London on the top, then it switches interwar, New York and London. Okay, then Bretton Woods, it's New York, but London's still around, and you have all these other places. And then the second year of globalization, which is today, okay, we can see that it's still New York, but there are a lot of other hubs that are coming along. And so what we do in this paper is, okay, before I get into the history, so the question is why did the regime switch? Well, there are a number of reasons. One is advances in technology and growth. Another are major institutional changes, wars, geopolitical reasons like alliances, and reform proposals. Like after the gold standard was breaking down, people like Jevons and Marshall and Fisher came up with plans for new regimes. The gold exchange standard was in trouble. It was a debate between NERCSA and Habeler. With Bretton Woods, the problems were outlaid by Milton Friedman and Robert Mundell. So these are all the reasons why these regimes shift. And what I want to do now is to look at some history. So this is the gold standard. This is the period I know a lot about. Okay, so look, on the upper panel, you've got, go back. Okay, the upper panel, you've got gold is the center. That's the hub, and it's the British pound, and there are other currencies. And you can translate the tree diagrams on the left into the circles on the right. Okay, and it looks like the solar system. And then on the bottom, we've got the international financial system. And here you've got London, other places like Paris and Berlin. Okay, and you can see this in terms of the circles. And on the right, I tell you the stories. It's about, you know, the reasons why, you know, there are low transactions costs under the gold standard, and that sterling developed all these other features. It was good as a store. Gold was good as a store of value, as a medium of exchange, unit of account. Sterling was convertible into gold, and that evolved as the key currency, and there were network externalities. And the same thing could be said about the international financial system, which is centered on London, and then other centers developed, but it's based on sterling bills, which ties it all together. Okay, so that's the gold standard. This is the gold exchange standard. Now you got gold at the center, but you got both two currencies. You got the dollar and the pound, okay, and it still looks like the gold standard, but now you got the two currencies. The networks, the international financial system, so it's weaker after World War I, and it centers on London and New York. It's gradually taking over. Okay, then here we go to the Bretton Woods period, and we've got gold at the center still, but now it's the dollar, and it's the gold dollar system, low transactions costs. Okay, low transactions costs and foreign currency transactions, and so you have the gold dollar system. The story is familiar, how it persists for a long time because the U.S. is the financial intermediary for the world. Triffin dilemma comes along about how we could have a run on the dollar, And then it does break down with the great inflation. And in the international financial system, New York is the key financial center. London is still important. You have the sterling area, but then London dies out by 1967. Finally, the second last is the managed float. The dollar's at the center. Financial center is New York. Okay, it's based on credibility for low inflation. And you've got open capital accounts now, so you have the opening up of the international financial system. But you've got other let's go back. Okay. You've got other centers coming along. The new regional centers are coming along with Europe, et cetera. So you see, getting back to this picture, see how New York is the center, but these other hubs are opening up. And then finally, we get to the question of what about the future? Well, okay, the central place is still the dollar, the financial center is still New York, okay? But there's still relatively high transaction costs in foreign currency transactions because of currency risk, okay? And so the international monetary system is the dollar, but now there's the renminbi's coming along, okay? But the dollar dominance is likely. There's likely to be the growth of regional currencies. This has been brought up by others, okay? And digital currencies coming along, they may solve some of the problems of interoperability and may actually lead to a big change in the story, okay? And then as far as the international financial system, the growing regional networks that will come, but I think that New York's going to dominate for a long time. Okay, well listen, I think that's all I can do. I'm sorry for the sketchy slides, and thank you.
Thank you very much. I suggest that in the remaining of the time, maybe we'll open the floor for Q&A, and we'll try to use the old-fashioned technology without PowerPoints, answering any questions that you may have. So please.
I have a question to Professor Sebastian Edwards, that undoubtedly the Federal Reserve does play, to some extent, a role of global lender of last resort. Many large foreign banks are primary dealers of the Federal Reserve, so they can draw dollar liquidity from the Federal Reserve. During the global financial crisis between 2007 and 2008, the Federal Reserve extended FX swaps not only to ECB but to Swiss National Bank and several other central banks. The same story during COVID, that they extended FX swaps to many other central banks. My question is that Federal Reserve cannot afford to take a risk to extend even FX swaps to poor countries. And I know that it is still political science fiction, but maybe from economic point of view, it would be rational to come back to the idea of John Maynard Keynes and to create international clearing union. I mean, simply settlement system within the International Monetary Fund, and to convert special drawing rights into real currency, and to start to think about creating international market for for bonds denominated in SDRs, like it was in the 70s. because this idea was promoted in the 70s, but it didn't work because IMF was not able to be a market maker simply on this market. So I know that it is still political science fiction, but how do you perceive the economic dimension of this situation? Thank you.
So that's a great question. In fact, there are many questions in what you said, and they are related to, I think, the 4 presentations in this panel. I agree with you that that's political science fiction, and that we can go back and revisit the Keynes proposal. We can go back and look at his pamphlet of 1933 and his newspaper articles. I don't think that we will have movement in that direction. Now, let me elaborate on a couple of other things that you said related to Professor Eisenman's presentation. The Federal Reserve certainly was very active and very aware of the international repercussion of the crisis in 2008 and also during COVID. And it extended swap lines to a number of countries, but only to large countries. So Argentina was never included, up to, I would say, around Brazil. Brazil got swap lines. The European, of course, the Swiss National Bank, as you said, was incorporated. But the Philippines did not. The Philippines is a huge country, and they did not get swap lines. Argentina did not. If you go back to a previous crisis, 1994-95, the Fed did not help Mexico. It was the Treasury through the Exchange Rate Stabilization Fund that was created in 1934 after the devaluation of the dollar. When the dollar went from 20.67 dollars per ounce to 35, there was a huge capital gain because the Treasury had a lot of gold. That was created, as Mike has worked, and I think Harold James as well, into the Exchange Rate Stabilization Plan that the Treasury used to help Mexico. So I think that politics are in the way here big time. And if you are a poor country or a smaller country, even though geopolitically you may be Indonesia, it may happen or it may not happen. So I think that it's more, I think, realistic to think of coordination rather than a unified currency. The SDR, of course, is a joke, right? And the addition of the renminbi to the SDR as one of the currencies of the special drawing rights, if you go through the politics of that and all the lobbying that China did, it shows how political that is. One thing that I did 2 weeks ago is I listened to Jay Powell's press conference, which was on a Wednesday. And then on Thursday, Madame Christine Lagarde gave her press conference. And they were almost identical. The body language, the terms used, the targets, the aspirations. So I don't know if they talked to each other before, but the coordination is happening between the major central banks. And I think that that's the route that we're going to see. Now, a question that Michael addressed was whether CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, will force additional coordination. But I think that the notion of having a Keynes type of plan, it would be nice, but it ain't happening anytime soon, in my view. You want to add something, Mike, to that?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think
you agree with me. Say that.
I agree completely with. I mean, I agree with everything that Sebastian said. I mean, the key thing is that it's not in the Federal Reserve's interest to take care of all the countries in the world. So they think in terms of systemic risk. What's going to affect the United States? And those are the countries that they help out with the swap lines. Okay, and who's in the U.S.'s strategic interest? And the other countries that aren't, they aren't going to do anything unless they have to. And so you need some kind of coordination, but you really can't enforce it. And the IMF can't do it. The IMF is governments. So it's the BIS, the way I see it is in terms of crises, it's the BIS that has the technologies to do this, but again, there's no power. So I think that until you can work out some kind of arrangements where there's mutual agreements across the world, you're always going to have this problem of the winners and the losers.
Let me add something to that, what Mike said. In the Mexican crisis, I think that we have forgotten the Mexican crisis of 94, 95. The Secretary of the Treasury of Mexico, Jesus Silva Herzog, went to Washington and talked to Secretary of the Treasury, Don Regan. And explained to him, tomorrow we are going to default on our debt. And the holders of those debt were all American banks. So on the way out, Don Regan told Chucho Silva Herzog, Mr. Secretary, you have a big problem in your hands. And Silva Herzog was shocked by that statement. And he turned to Regan and said, Mr. Secretary, we have a big problem in our hands. And the Americans had not realized that. That's number one. Then Miguel Mancera, who was the governor of the Bank of Mexico, went to the Fed and asked for a swap line, and the chairman of the Fed said, you guys don't belong to any of the 12 regional banks. We cannot help you. So there's politics and there's short-sightedness, and I think it's less short-sightedness now, but the same amount of politics.
Let me maybe add to Sebastian's comments that there is this important political economy concern of the Fed. Because if you're looking at the Senate and the like, in the Republican Party, you have a fair share of people that are looking for the first mistake of the Fed, and the mistake may be some problems with repaying the swap lines in order to cut the alleged independence of the Fed. So chances are that Chinese swap lines are not characterized by this type of constraints, and China is using them assertively as part of its mechanism of dealing with the huge debt overhang of all the Belt countries. So the political economy story is alive here, and because of the growing polarization in the US between the two parties, I think that the Fed should work very carefully not to be exposed, and I think that the new facilities, the FEMA and the like, is a compromise that hopefully will allow the Fed to be more assertive. Thank you. Other questions or comments?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I have mine. I have a question to Professor de Grauwe. Because your argument about the fragile monetary union sounds very convincing, but at the same time, the countries like Poland, which are in the European Union but outside the EMU, have also sort of more fragile economic and financial system following the mega shocks you've mentioned. I mean, the pandemic and now the war and so on. So my question is whether and to what extent our aspirations, but also obligation from the treaties to sooner or later to join the EMU are affected by this new, let's say, fragility of the monetary union institutional setup. Whether, for example, comparing Poland and Slovakia, the country that joined the EMU just when the global financial crisis was in the full swing, but they seem to be quite successful. So now, also following Croatian decision, how do you assess the arguments in favor and against joining by Poland the EMU? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's like an exam question I ask students, right? So should Poland join the monetary union? It's a very interesting question. And I understand that in Poland there have been different movements in the past with periods where there was some kind of willingness to join, and other periods where this did not this was not maintained. Whatever you do, there are risks involved, right? I mean, you say quite correctly that under the present conditions, there are also risks involved for Poland. It has to maintain some stability in foreign exchange markets, and that creates risks. If you join the monetary union, these risks will disappear, but other risks, as I pointed out, may arise, and surely there will be some, if you do that, there will be some loss of sovereignty in that essentially the bond market, the government bond market, as I told you, will be more prone to potential crisis and putting pressure on you to maintain some fiscal discipline. So these are the risks that you face, and whatever you do, there will be some risks involved. If you ask me, what should Poland do, join or not join? I think what we know now from the economics of all this is that in the end, in terms of long-term growth potential, it doesn't make much difference, right? Whether you are in a monetary union or not in a monetary union. There is very little evidence that being in a monetary union boosts your economic growth or the other way around. So you should not expect too much of that. That has been actually a big problem when we started the monetary union. Those who designed the monetary union actually created the fiction that being in a monetary union would create more scope for growth. And that has not turned out to be true. We have not seen that at all. So don't count on that, right? That you will have more growth or whatever. So you have to evaluate all these different risks. And of course, as you also mentioned, the treaty tells you that, in fact, you should join the monetary union at some point, provided the Maastricht convergence criteria are satisfied. But I don't see why you couldn't satisfy this. But as you know, there is a loophole in the treaty that is being exploited by countries like Sweden, which is that you can refuse. One of the conditions is that before entering the monetary union, you should have a fixed exchange rate with the euro during 2 years. And now what Sweden is doing is to not fixing the exchange rate with the euro and then claiming that because the exchange rate is not fixed, it does not satisfy the Maastricht, one of the Maastricht convergence criteria. So you have the option to do the same, and the ball is in your camp. You will have to decide whether the perceived benefits of joining a monetary union will exceed the perceived costs of a monetary union, and that's a very difficult exercise to perform. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. There is a room for a last question, potentially. Please.
Yeah, and then I'll say something.
Okay, this is for Paul. I really like your talk. So the way I see things now is, and I gave a talk at the ECB a little while ago, but in a sense, the inflation, we have inflation problem both in the US and Europe. Europe is worse, okay? And what's happening is the tightening process, okay, is leading to a credit crunch in the US, and there's, of course, the problems in Switzerland. Europe doesn't have, the EMU does not have a complete banking union, and you've got this great diversion in inflation rates. You've got these really differences between the emerging countries and the advanced countries in the Eurozone. Okay, so the tightening process seems to me like it could lead to serious financial stress and serious problems which might affect their credibility for low inflation. And I wondered if you could react to that, please.
Well, sure, that's a risk. In fact, I mentioned that risk in my talk. Up to now, it has not really materialized, but as you point out, quite rightly so, there is a very big divergence in inflation experiences within the Eurozone, right? In particular, some Baltic countries have experienced inflation rates exceeding 20%, while others, like France and Spain, have been around 5 or 6%. So you have a huge divergence there, and if that is maintained for a sufficiently long period of time, we'll be in trouble, right? And some of these countries may have very big adjustment problems that may then trigger the kind of prices that we have seen in the past. So there is a looming problem there that has to do with the fact that actually there's too much divergence in inflation rates, and this may turn up to become a big problem in the future. And I guess that's also why the ECB is cautious, or has been relatively cautious in its anti-inflationary policy compared to the US and to Britain, because it faces this additional dilemma that I mentioned compared to these other central banks.
Very briefly, I think that Poland right now is in the best of worlds, and I think that Paul gave a good answer relating it also to Sweden. Maintaining the option open of joining forces some discipline on the central bank, because if you become, and I'm going to go back to the favorite non-well-behaved country with this Argentina, any country that behaves like Argentina kills the option of joining the euro, and that's a valuable option. It has a value. So if you maintain the option, you'll have to be normal and behave relatively well, and you have some credibility, but then you have some flexibility. That's point number one. So if I were to advise the Polish government, I would say, don't join yet, but keep the option open. Regarding the difference in inflation in the Eurozone, what's very interesting is that I have no idea what's the difference in inflation where Mike lives in New Jersey and where I live, which is in California. I know a lot about economics, and I advise governments and banks and investors. But if one of my clients or my students ask me, what's the difference between inflation in New Jersey and California, my answer is, I have no idea. Right? And the question is, will the Eurozone, the EMU, ever get to that point? And we don't have also in the US the difference, regional difference with the aversion that Germany has to inflation and the laxity that the Mediterranean countries have. So the politics and the institutional comes back into this, and we'll have to see how this evolves.
Okay, any last comments or question? Otherwise, thank you very much for your attention, and all the best to the organizers and to all of us. Thanks.